Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Cuba has been in a state of collapse for the last few months. The power network has been failing, and that's resulted in nationwide blackouts. And unfortunately, those nationwide blackouts are continuing. And these blackouts are a combination of Cuba's lack of oil because its power network relies on oil for the generation of electricity, which seems like a crazy thing to do. But because the network was built in the 1960s, when Cuba was very close to Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then, and the Soviet Union was providing lots of free oil, it seemed like a great idea at that point. However, obviously today, having oil as your basic fuel source to produce electricity is the single most expensive way of producing electricity, so it's absolutely crazy. But the other problem that Cuba has is that over the past 50 years, it hasn't been maintaining those oil-fired power stations, and so they're now breaking down on a regular basis. So the current lack of electricity is a combination of Cuba not being able to afford the fuel. It can't afford to buy in huge quantities of oil to keep those power stations running, but also they can't afford to repair the power stations, so that's why they keep breaking down. And the Cuban authorities are blaming the USA for being in this situation. Firstly, they're saying that they can't actually access all of the parts that they need to repair the power stations because of the sanctions that the USA have put in place against Cuba. But also, they're saying that the sanctions have destroyed the Cuban economy over the course of the past 50 or 60 years. And unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, Cuba also lies in the hurricane path. And this year, it's been hit with 4 hurricanes above Category 3 strength. And the most recent hurricane, Rafael, caused widespread damage across the country.
The 17th named storm of the season has affected 10 million people in Cuba. Rafael packed 185 kilometers an hour winds, which uprooted trees and damaged homes. Life is slowly coming back to the deserted streets of Havana. Most businesses, transport services, and schools were closed as the hurricane made landfall.
I have never seen this in 61 years. Yesterday was my birthday, and I had a very sad birthday because I saw the stadium falling apart, the towers falling down, and the roof tiles flying around. I have never seen that in my life, ever.
It's the third major power outage in just a couple of weeks. Rafael uprooted poles and damaged transmission lines. That's after Hurricane Oscar and another power failure due to aging infrastructure. There's been criticism of the government for failing to provide essential services. Changing climate patterns means frequency and ferocity of hurricanes has increased.
Now, one of the main advantages that Cuba does have is its climate. It's located in the Caribbean Ocean and receives a lot of sunshine. So you would expect that it should have developed its renewable energy in the form of solar panels. And in 2014, the Cuban authorities came out and said that by 2030, their objective was to achieve 24% of electricity production from solar. But unfortunately, 10 years on from that statement, Cuba has only achieved around 2% of its electricity production from solar panels. And the reason for that is because the Cuban authorities can't afford to install all of these panels. However, they recently came out and said that Cuban businesses now have an obligation to develop their own solar capacity. The 16-page decree published by the Cuban authorities stipulates that Cuban businesses must now produce 50% of their electricity requirements from a renewable source, which presumably would be solar, because it's quite difficult to be able to set up your own wind farm. Cuban businesses must also limit their use of air conditioning and can't have a temperature below 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees centigrade. And they must also have provisions in place to be able to produce their own electricity for up to 72 hours. So basically, they would need to have a generator to be able to do that. So this is basically putting the onus onto all of the Cuban businesses, which I think is quite an interesting development because Cuba is still a communist country. So theoretically, all of these businesses should be part of the wider state production and therefore should be looked after by the state. But basically what the Cuban authorities are saying here is that these businesses must fund the production of their own electricity up to 50% and be able to cover themselves in the event of blackouts. So they're basically putting the cost of that onto all of these businesses. So we're moving more towards a capitalist setup whereby businesses are going to have to fund themselves rather than relying on the state. And in terms of trying to achieve that 24% of production from solar panels, in March 2024 it was announced that China had signed a deal with the Cuban authorities to build 92 solar farms. And these solar farms are designed to produce over 2,000 megawatts of electricity. And just to put that into context, currently the total amount of solar energy that Cuba has produces around 286 megawatts, so this would be a 10 times increase. And in 2024, only 12 megawatts have been added. So since that agreement was signed, there hasn't really been any movement forward. And one of the problems that's been talked about a lot is that China, when it goes into countries like Cuba, the way that it develops the infrastructure is through loans. So basically, a company is set up, that company then takes on a lot of loans, and those loans have to be paid back to China. And one of the problems that Cuba has is that it has a long history of not paying back any of its loans. So China, I think, is a bit cautious in terms of pumping lots of money into Cuba because it's unlikely to get it back. Historically, one of the biggest industries in Cuba was the production of sugar from its sugarcane plantations. However, over the past 10 years, along with a lot of other industry in Cuba, there has been a lack of investment. And the problem with not investing into the sugarcane industry is that it's now closed down a lot of the mills, and it doesn't have sufficient pesticide or fertilizer to produce the same amount of crop that it had historically. And over the past 12 to 18 months, the problem for Cuba is that it's now become a sugar importer.
Sugarcane has long been king in Cuba. However, while the island nation once produced millions of tons of sugar, next year local media say it's only expecting a fraction of that, some 300,000 tons. It's a bitter symbol of agriculture's decline in Cuba. Supply shortages plague the country's farms and have hit sugar especially hard. This decaying tower in the city of Artemisa marks one of the many mills no longer churning out raw sugar across the island. There were once 100 putting out product both for Cuban consumers and exports. Now, production of cane is dominated by state mills in Cuba's communist-run economy. The government said this week that with less cane, a record low of only 15 mills will be open for sugar production. That's down from 24 the year before. The government says that since tough U.S. sanctions and an economic crisis sparked by COVID-19, food production and processing in Cuba has fallen over 40%. Officials have not reported this year's output, but a Reuters estimate of around 300,000 tons is similar to production in the late 1800s.
Now, probably the most famous usage of Cuban sugar is the production of Cuban rum. And Bacardi is one of the world's longest standing rum brands. It was actually created in 1862 in Cuba, and it maintained its position as one of the biggest brands in Cuba for the next 100 years. However, following the revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro's regime seized all of the assets within Cuba of the Bacardi business, and the family that owned it decided that they wanted to leave the country. They fled, and luckily for them, they had facilities set up in Puerto Rico and Mexico, and so they continued producing rum outside of Cuba. And the business subsequently established itself in Bermuda. Now, the single most famous brand that Bacardi had was Havana Club, and they had a worldwide trademark on that. However, due to financial difficulties, that trademark lapsed in 1973, and the Cuban authorities, which owned the old Bacardi business in Cuba, registered it in 1976. And this has been a bone of contention between the two businesses ever since. In 1993, the Cuban authorities signed a worldwide export agreement with Pernod Ricard to export its Havana Club brand. And in 1995, the Bacardi business headquartered in Bermuda signed an agreement to export its Havana Club all across the USA. Now, the Cuban authorities were very unhappy about this because they claim that they now own the Havana Club brand. However, in 1999, a law was passed in the USA commonly referred to as the Bacardi Act, which denies worldwide trademark protection for any Cuban business that expropriated assets, so basically where the Cuban authorities seized the assets of all of the Bacardi business in Cuba and nationalized them, the USA is saying that that was an illegal act and therefore the trademark protection does not apply. And on December the 3rd, 2024, US President Joe Biden introduced an additional law banning the recognition of trademarks confiscated by the Cuban government, which further cements Bacardi's rights to the Havana Club rum brand in the United States. In response to this, Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Perea said that this latest legislation modifies the law in an aggression against Cuba in order to open the door in violation of international law for theft of Cuban brands legitimately registered in that country. As part of his presidential manifesto, Donald Trump has promised a crackdown on illegal immigration in the USA, and it's estimated that up to 1 million people could be deported every single year during his presidency. And as part of that, there will be a lot of Cubans who are currently living in the USA who potentially could be sent back to Cuba. In response to this, Cuba's deputy foreign minister has said that a large-scale deportation back to Cuba would be drastic and unfair. He went on to say that trying to deport tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Cubans to Cuba would be uprooting people who have already made their lives in the United States. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this update because it's quite difficult to be able to find news on Cuba. So what I'm trying to do is aggregate information, bring together as much information as I can in each of these postings so that you can get a flavour as to what's going on. And clearly the underlying theme here is that there are still major problems in Cuba, which is not surprising because there isn't a silver bullet. There's no magic wand that can be waved to solve all of these problems. The fundamental issue that Cuba is facing is that it doesn't have enough money. It doesn't export enough products to be able to bring in enough cash to be able to pay for all of the things that it needs to. And added on top of that, the way that the electricity system has been constructed, it's dependent on oil, which is the most expensive fuel that you could imagine to produce electricity. And as we discussed earlier, the reason why the system operates like this is because back in the 60s and 70s, Cuba was receiving lots of free oil, firstly from the Soviet Union and then latterly in the 1990s from Venezuela. However, unfortunately, those freebies have stopped or they've reduced significantly. Venezuela is still sending oil to Cuba in exchange for things like doctors who go over and visit the country for long periods of time. However, the amount of oil coming from Venezuela has reduced significantly. And Cuba is now dependent on countries like Mexico and Russia also giving it free oil. However, it simply doesn't get enough. And added on top of that issue, the power stations themselves are old and decrepit and breaking down all of the time. So Cuba is now experiencing widespread blackouts. And the problem, as we've discussed before, is that if you're a business in Cuba that's producing things and all of a sudden you don't have any electricity for 12 hours, and that might be your peak period when you're trying to produce everything, when all of your staff have turned up to work, then you simply can't do anything unless you set up your own generator and your own solar panels. And that's what the Cuban authorities have now told all of the businesses in Cuba to do. They're basically saying you'll have to fend for yourself because we can't produce enough electricity that you can rely upon. So basically what we're seeing here is that all of these businesses will now have to fend for themselves in terms of paying for that infrastructure. They'll have to set up their own mini generators and solar panel systems to be able to fund their own businesses. So this is definitely a move towards capitalism. Everybody's going to have to survive for themselves. But the problem that you've got is that those businesses are still operating in a communist country. So you've got the worst of both worlds, really, if you're one of those companies, because you've still got the state to report to and pay taxes and all the rest of it, but they're not helping you in terms of providing things like electricity, which are obviously very basic. And what we've also seen in today's video is that the lack of power and the lack of investment is now also starting to hurt other parts of the economy, such as the sugar industry, which historically was very strong from Cuba's perspective. It was exporting sugar all around the world, which was bringing in vital revenue. However, even that industry is now in a situation whereby it's having to import. So it doesn't produce enough sugar to be able to actually monetize it and make money for the country. So this really tells you that Cuba is in a very dire situation at the moment. And in similar situations around the world, we've seen China stepping in as a lender, coming in and helping build the infrastructure. And back in March of this year, China did agree to build lots of solar farms. However, that hasn't actually come to fruition yet. And one of the problems that China is facing is whether or not Cuba will be able to pay back any of the loans that it needs to set up to build all of that infrastructure. So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in Cuba remains critical. There is a lack of electricity on a daily basis. We're seeing nationwide blackouts. That's having a detrimental impact on all of the businesses in Cuba, and that's likely to make the situation worse, because if those businesses can't actually operate, they can't produce anything, therefore they can't sell anything, they can't make any revenue, and this is becoming a really vicious circle from Cuba's perspective. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
Evidentemente la sensación con la que está generándose este tipo de cosas acá ha complicado un poco la seguridad del sector y también de lo que hoy en día se puede considerar, sí, y evidentemente